Hello students, welcome to the Challenging Concepts video on Peripheral Nervous System and the Reflex Arc, Chapter 13 from the Mariam textbook. So first we'll do a little recap on the sensory receptors, or rather introduction to the sensory receptors. So they are specialized structures and organs which respond to a stimulus. A stimulus is a change in environment. So it could be temperature change, for example, and so on, right? So their activation results in a graded potential. So hopefully you recall from our conversation with nervous tissue and action potentials, chapter 11 is graded potentials are proportional to the stimulus strength, right? So this the change will be proportional and they decay unlike action potential. The receptors are classified three ways on the type of stimulus they detect, on the location of the stimulus that comes on, so whether it's inside the body, outside of the body, or the body themselves, and then structural complexity, so they are either simple or complex receptors. So we're going to look at the first two. So by stimulus type, we have mechanoreceptors, thermoreceptors, photoreceptors, chemoreceptors, and nociceptors. So mechanoreceptors will sense, as the name suggests, mechanical change. So they're going to be for touch, pressure, vibration, and stretch. So those are going to be, when we looked at the channels, gated channels, mechanically gated, mechanoreceptors generally use that. Then hopefully next one's obvious is the thermoreceptor is a change in temperature. So they are sensitized by either a drop or rise in temperature. Photoreceptors, photons, I beg your pardon, are units of light. So that will be retina. The photoreceptors will be cones and rods that will be sensitive to for the light energy, right? Then chemoreceptors, chemicals. These are chemicals either in a fluid, in air too, like our olfactory sense, our sense of smell will detect, the receptors will detect the chemicals in the air, and then they are able to analyze, right? So taste, smell, even some biochemical changes like how much water is there. Our hypothalamus detects the osmolarity of the blood, right? And then nociceptors, easy way I'd say is if someone's in pain, sometimes they shout, right? So noise, if that helps. Nociceptors are receptors that are sensitive to pain. So extreme heat or cold, extreme pressure, some chemicals that cause inflammation, all will sensitize this, and we'll talk a little bit more about them in this video. Classification by location. So extero is what is outside of the body. So it's the stimulus. This is in regards to where the stimulus is. It's not the location of the receptors themselves. It's the stimulus is coming from the outside of the body, right? So it can be touch, pressure, pain. All our special sense organs are exteroreceptors because they're sensitive to stimuli that are coming from outside of the body. Intero is within the body. So they are also sometimes called visceral receptors. So any changes in our blood vessels, any changes in the internal organs will be sensitized by these. Then proprioceptors, these are proprioception. Proprioception is the sense of position sense. So we have receptors in our bones, joints, not bones, rather joints, muscle, tendons, and so on, which will give us information about the position of those of the rest of the body. Let's talk about potential changes next. So in terms of receptors, they are called generator potential because this is in this general sense receptors. They're called generator potential because that stimulus will result in an action potential, right? So it will create a graded potential, which will reach, once it reaches threshold in the neuron, it will create a action potential. In special senses, it's a little bit different. Okay, we will have a graded potential, but here we'll just call it as receptor potential. It is not a generator potential. It just controls the amount of neurotransmitters that are released. And we will look at this very good example in our eye when we talk about special senses, chapter 15 of our textbook. We will talk about how the light that strikes our rods and cones, how they will control the amount of neurotransmitter released by those cells, which then would or would not cause a action potential. It will be a greater potential. It could be the inhibitory, so it will be hyperpolarization, or it could be excitatory, which will be a depolarization. So it just controls the amount of neurotransmitter. So hence not called generator potential. Let's talk about a little bit about adaptation. So if you Google adaptation, most often it comes about the eye. This is not that, right? So this adaptation is in reference to a decrease in sensitivity of a receptor with constant stimulus. So a very good example is the sense of smell. So you're cooking something, someone's cooking something, you're in the room, initially you smell that wonderful smell, but after some time you do not. Does that mean that smell is not present anymore? Right? It is, because when we go out from that room into another room outside the house and then come back in, we smell that smell again, right? Our receptors are being stimulated. So it's kind of a way that our brain has changed, because it keeps kind of wants to kind of sift through the information, right? So it doesn't need to keep on saying, oh, I have it's a nice smelling food here, nice smelling food here, nice smelling food here, right? Doesn't want that information constantly being passed on. So fast adaptings are the ones that change quickly. Sense of smell I mentioned. If touch receptors also fast adapting, you may when we are wearing clothes, if we are not moving, we do not even notice, if we close our eyes, what kind of clothes we might be wearing, even whether it's short sleeve, full sleeve, shorts, pants, right? You just wiggle a little, you just move your arms a little, then because that constant stimulus has been taken off and it's considered a newer stimulus, you'll feel it, right? Tonic is on the other scale, whether they do not adapt or very slowly. One example is pain receptors. They are considered tonic because sense of pain, as unpleasant as it is, it's an important information for our brain, right? It tells us about actual or impeding damage, right? So it's a protective action. So we need that information, even though we may tolerate that pain and then put up with it, but that pain will be aware of it. Okay, so extreme pressure, temperature, I mentioned earlier. Histamine also stimulates nociceptors. Potassium, you might guess why potassium sensitive to. If you remember where we have most potassium, inside or outside the cell, it is inside. So if there's a high amount of potassium, that could mean that the cells are broken up, which is why they're sensitive to that. Okay, pain is also blocked by our own endogenous opioids. We have endorphins. We release endorphins with moderate exercise. If we strain too much, then it does not become pleasurable, and then it can, when you start really basically, once we damage muscles, then it goes into pain, right? But that's why it is a protective action, right? So we're expecting some little bit of damage when we exercise, so our body produces endorphins to dull down that pain, so you don't feel it. Normal physiological change. So I want to talk about pain tolerance next. It's different from pain threshold. It's incorrectly used when someone says a person has a low pain threshold. That is incorrect. So threshold is just basically whether it's pain or something, that's the minimum, right? Everybody feels pain at the same threshold. Okay, they can perceive pain. It's just that some people are able to tolerate pain more than others. Okay, so we would not, if someone uses it as low pain threshold, they are incorrectly using it. It's really low pain tolerance, right? So if someone's sensitive to pain, they just have a low pain tolerance, not low pain threshold. Then next, we're going to talk about referred pain, different from radiating pain, right? So referred pain is when a pain is felt to a different part of the body that's not the pain, not from where the pain is coming from, right? It's very common with a heart attack, with an MI, that people experience pain in the left arm or left jaw. It's very common. So it's not really arising from the left arm or left jaw. It's just that the nerves that come from this region in the heart go to the same spot in the brain. So that's perceived as coming from a different one. Radiating pain, on the other hand, a good example is sciatic pain, sciatica, right? It starts at the back, it shoots down one of the legs, it shoots down the whole path of that nerve. Okay, it's different from referred pain. Next, I want to talk about phantom limb pain. This is real. This is in patients who've had basically traumatic. It's not patients who had neuropathies that ended up or together with gangrene or some sort of like diabetic patients generally do not feel phantom limb pain when they have their toes or foot removed. This is usually a little more traumatic. A lot of military personnel who's lost their limbs feels this pain. They are completely aware that they do not have that part of their body, but they will tell you, doc, I have pain in the foot that I do not have. And it initially was thought to be a psychological disorder, but it's been proven not. It's actually because those nerves are still present at that, say, if they have a below knee amputation, the nerves that brought that pain sensation from the foot are still present at the knee, right? So from that amputation point, it is believed that those nerves are being stimulated. So it's very painful. Patients cannot are very require very high painkillers. Some even require epidurals, epidural anesthesia to keep those pain at bay. So next, we're going to talk about the neuron and connective tissue covering. Similar to what we had in the muscle, we also have connective tissue around cells, fascicles, and the whole organ. Here it's the nerve. So similar endo, peri, and epi. It's the end that's different, right? It's neurium instead of mycium. So endoneurium basically covers one cell, but what we also need to remember is if it's myelinated, the endoneurium's outside of the myelin, because if we put it inside, right on the axon, we've just taken out the function of the myelin. Okay, the perineurium surrounds a collection of neurons, and then the epineurium surrounds the whole nerve as an organ. Okay. Then classification of nerves. Most of our nerves are mixed nerves. Very few are purely sensory or purely motor. So those are our cranial nerves that are few, and we'll talk about some of them today. In terms of fibers, they can be classified as somatic afferent, somatic efferent. So this is going to the body, whether it's sensory or motor, to the skeletal muscle, and then visceral afferent, sensory again from our viscera, and then visceral efferent, some motor fibers that go to our smooth, cardiac, and glands. Peripheral nerves are generally classified as cranial or spinal. Cranial comes from our brain, that's 12 pairs of cranial nerves. Spinal nerves come from our spinal cord, 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Another thing we want to remind ourselves is the ganglia we mentioned in the last chapter, a collection of neuron cell bodies outside of the central nervous system, so within the peripheral nervous system. In the central nervous system, hopefully you will recall, it is called nuclei, plural, nucleus singular. So now let's go to cranial nerves one more time. We introduced this when we were talking about the brain stem, but let's talk more about them. So numbered 1 through 12, using the Roman numerals. I like this mnemonic. It helps. It uses the anatomy as one of the main features, and the first letters will help us with the cranial nerve names. So cranial nerve 1 is olfactory, cranial nerve 2 is optic, cranial nerve 3 is um, oculomotor, cranial nerve 4 is trochlear, cranial nerve 5 is trigeminal, 6 abducens, 7 facial, 8 vestibulocochlear, 9 glossopharyngeal, 10 vagus, 11 accessory, and hypoglossals are 12. So olfactory, sense of smell, right? Nice and easy. Optic, sense of vision. Oculomotor, it moves muscles. It moves eye muscles, ocular eye muscles. So we have 6 extrinsic eye muscles that help to move the eyeball, each of the eyeballs. 4 of those muscles are innervated by this. We'll go into detail in the chapter on special senses about the nerves. So we have 4 rectus muscles, recti muscles, and 2 oblique ones. So superior oblique and lateral rectus are not innervated by cranial nerve number 3. Superior oblique is by the next one, trochlear nerve, that innervates that. By the way, oculomotor also will constrict our pupils as well. So it's going to have some autonomic nervous system innervation. Number 5 is a mixed nerve. It has general sense that comes from the face. This I have seen as some students make this error because they think of face as being facial. Facial nerve, the reason for the face is that it moves our facial expressions, but touch, general sense from our face, and even scalp is by trigeminal nerve. And it also has a motor function that is motor for mastication, moving to chewing for the masseter muscle, right? Number 6 is abducens, named after the way it moves the eye, abducts the eye. So it's the lateral rectus muscle. When it contracts, it's going to shorten, it's going to turn the eye laterally outwards, right? Abducts it. Let's talk about, before that, sorry, number 7. So I mentioned the motor function. One of the motor functions is facial expressions. We also have tearing and salivation as other functions of facial nerve. In terms of the sensory part of facial nerve, it's for sense of taste in the anterior front 2/3 of our tongue. Posterior 2/3 by number 9. If you Google cranial nerves for taste, you'll also get number 10, but that's not of the tongue. It's of our oral cavity. It's of the pharynx. It's of the epiglottis is by 10. So anterior 2/3 of our tongue is by facial nerve. Then vestibulocochlear, mainly considered sensory. There is some tiny motor component. So it takes sensory information for hearing and equilibrium and balance, right? So it'll take that information. The motor function is basically to kind of tighten up the receptors themselves. So if you hear a loud thud, a screech, you kind of cringe. Kind of that also helps to, as a reflex, it will help the sensitivity of those receptors in our ear to change as well. So that's the motor function of it. Glossopharyngeal, mentioned about the sensory, that's this posterior 1/3 of our tongue for taste. It also has motor functions. It's for swallowing. Glosso means tongue. Pharyngeal means the pharynx, the back part of our throat. So you can imagine the motion of swallowing involves these two, right? So it's swallowing is because of glossopharyngeal mainly, but not exclusively. 10 is involved there too. And also salivation. So this innervates the biggest salivary glands, our parotid glands, which are found posterior to our masseter muscles. Number 10 is big, and this is the only muscle that leaves our head and neck. It actually goes to the chest and abdominal areas. It will innervate both, it gets sensory information and motor information to and from our internal organs. Okay. Then number 11 is called accessory. It kind of is an extra for our spinal nerves. You can think of it that way. It innervates the neck muscle, sternocleidomastoid, trapezius, it will innervate those two. Hypoglossal, so hypo means below, glossal, I mentioned glossus to do with the tongue, so right now I'm using this a lot at the moment. It's for tongue movements for speech. So next we're going to talk about reflexes. We are either born with reflexes, some are they're considered to be intrinsic, they're predictable, some do change over time, right, as we age. So if you, for example, if you place your finger in a baby's hand, they will clench onto it, right? That's a reflex. You tickle the side of their mouth, they'll actually turn to that thinking that it is their milk that's going to be delivered to them. Then learned or acquired is something that we learn from practice or repetition. Driving skills is a learned skill or reflex, right? So we're driving very quietly on a straight road. Somebody pulls in front of us. We will swerve off that path, or we will put our brakes, and then maybe show some gestures if we are so inclined, right? But the reflex is to try and prevent us from kind of colliding with that other vehicle. Okay. Spinal versus cranial reflex. Hopefully this is kind of obvious. Spinal reflex goes through our spinal cord. That's our spinal nerves, so our limbs and even the trunk. While cranial reflexes, those are involving our cranial nerves. Somatic versus autonomic. Somatic involves our body, skeletal muscles. Autonomic involves our internal organs, right? For example, if you think of your favorite food, you can actually sense that your mouth is getting more moist, right? So saliva is produced as a reflex to that. So that's a easy reflex to think about. So let's talk about the reflex arc. There are 5 components. It's the receptor that senses the stimulus, right? So in this case, a nail growing through the skin, the receptor will be a nociceptor, which senses it, which gets innervated, gets activated by that stimulus. Then that information is sent down the sensory neuron or afferent with an A towards our central nervous system. Within the central nervous system, or called the integration center, we have an interneuron that connects it, and then a motor neuron. If a decision is made to, for example, move that part of the body away, it will send it down the motor neuron efferent pathway to our effector, which will cause that change. Next, we're going to talk of a couple of different reflexes: withdrawal reflex or flexor reflex. That is withdrawal of that same part, which sensitized a painful stimulus. That nail, if our foot lands on a nail, thumb tag, we will withdraw that that leg, right, that limb. So ipsilateral is same side. Then we have crossed extensor reflex. Excuse me. This is usually for balance. It could be the arms. We can learn this in martial arts too. So the same scenario where I talked about withdrawing that foot which touched or stepped on a glass or the thumb tag, we're withdrawing that. But if we were walking at that time, we'll make sure that our other leg is extended out, giving us the balance, right? So ipsilateral withdrawal with contralateral extensor. Then next is the spinal nerves. I mentioned this in the previous chapter. We have 31 pairs of spinal nerves, 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal. We use the first letters with the number to denote it, with one exception, the coccygeal. We use CO because C we use for cervical instead. Then next is plexus. Plexus is basically crisscrossing, converging, diverging of fibers, right? So we're sharing our fibers from different spinal nerves, which will form different peripheral nerves. This way, damage to one spinal nerve will not necessarily lead to paralysis of the muscle completely, right? Because multiple spinal nerves will be innervating a muscle. So let's talk about the plexus. We have 4 different plexuses, and I'm going to be concentrating on a few of the the motor nerves that arise from it. Mainly, I'll be talking about it, but of course, please note there's sensory components too, so do refer to your textbook. Cervical plexus form from C1, C4, spinal from C1, C4 of our spinal nerves. The major nerve from that is the phrenic nerve, which innervates the diaphragm, sensory and motor functions. If you have irritation of it, we will lead to hiccups, right? Um, so next is the brachial plexus. This is brachia, means upper limb, the arm. Please note here we have 5 different peripheral nerves which will arise from it. In terms of the spinal nerves which form it, it's C5 through T1. So axillary nerve is the first one we're going to talk about. It'll innervate our shoulder muscles, for example, our deltoid. Then we have radial nerve. Radial nerve basically runs on the posterior side. Remember the anatomical position, posterior side of our arm, and innervates all the extensors. So triceps brachii, the extensors in our forearm, which extend the wrist as well as our fingers. Then we have musculocutaneous. This innervates biceps brachii muscle as well as muscle underneath brachialis muscle. Then we have 2 nerves that go on the anterior side of our forearm. The ulnar nerve location's easy because it's on the same side as the ulnar bone, while the other side is not radial nerve because radial nerve is on the posterior side, it's the median nerve. And they will innervate the flexors of our wrist and of our fingers. Okay, so flexor carpi ulnaris will be stimulated or innervated by ulnar nerve, flexor carpi radialis, and others will be innervated by median nerve. Next, we'll talk about the lumbar plexus. It's from L1 through L4. It has 2 main nerves that comes from it. The femoral nerve, which will innervate our quadriceps and sartorius too, and then the obturator nerve, which passes through the obturator foramen and innervates the medial muscles, so gracilis and other adductor muscles too. The last one is our sacral plexus. It arises from L4 all the way down to L3. You might have heard of sciatica because the main nerve that comes from it is one big thick nerve. It's the biggest nerve of our body. Longest and thickest is the sciatic nerve that comes from the sacral plexus. It actually at just above the knee, at the back of our knee, it splits into 2, a tibial nerve and a common fibular nerve. They are named by the orientation. Hopefully you remember from conversations about our appendicular skeleton that the tibia is medially located while the fibula is laterally located. So the tibial nerve is the medial split and it stays at the back. So it's going to innervate our gastrocnemius and soleus, which is underneath that, while the common fibular nerve is the lateral split. That one actually curves around our knee and innervates the front anterior muscles of our forelegs. So for example, tibialis anterior is innervated by the common fibular nerve. So this is a quick recap of some challenging topics from our peripheral nervous system and reflex arc. I hope you found this video useful. I hope you have a great day and I will catch you in another video. Have a great day, everyone.